Hello, welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I am a professor of English at Stanford University. In this episode, we will be using Shakespeare's The Tempest to explore a variety of questions to do with colonialism, resistance, and the relationship between nature, artifice, and ideology as demonstrated in the play. A central focus will be on the ways in which the play allows us to think productively about the forms of colonial space making that inextricably connected ideas of self governance to those of beauty and proportion, and thus also suggested a hierarchy between the beautiful and the ugly for subjects of colonialism. Caliban's famous rebelliousness will be contrasted to Ariel's pliant obsequiousness to show how each of them is produced through forms of colonial ideology that is masked in the language of nature. The Tempest is Shakespeare's last play and was completed in 1610-1611. In it, he provides us with a unique dramatized exploration of the age of discovery and the contradictory responses toward the new world that was entailed in it. The age of discovery is loosely considered to have spanned from the beginning of the 15th century until roughly the middle of the 17th century and marks the phase of extensive European exploration led by Portugal and Spain that ultimately led to the arrival in the Americas and the Caribbean. Slavery was already brazenly practiced by various European nations, including England in the 16th century and leading right up to Shakespeare's play. Juan de Cordoba of Seville has been identified as the first merchant to have sent an African slave to the New World in 1502. But in 1510, systematic slavery was started in earnest when King Ferdinand of Spain authorized 50 African slaves to be transported to Santo Domingo. In 1555, a group of Africans from Shama in modern-day Ghana were brought as slaves to London by John Locke, a London merchant attempting to break into the slave trade. And in 1562, John Hawkins of Plymouth became the first documented English sailor to obtain slaves from Sierra Leone, numbering 300, for sale in the West Indies. By the end of the 16th century, there was estimated scores, if not hundreds of Black Africans in London, leading to royal proclamations by Elizabeth I calling for their owners to give them up so they could be deported from the realm. Attitudes in the period toward Africans was generally deeply pejorative. The several mentions by Prospero of the word slave in Shakespeare's play would thus have had ample resonance with ordinary people's understandings of the term in the metropolis. But the age of exploration was also the age of imaginative storytelling about the places that had been discovered. While travelers' tales did not start with the age of exploration, they did get intensified during that period and provided many examples of merchant and sailor tales that circulated widely. Some of these can be assumed to have been familiar to Shakespeare in his day. Stories of encounter as Europeans moved out in search of new lands rapidly evolved into accounts that sought to impose European patterns and ideas on the expanding physical world, while also providing models for thinking about these places for people in the metropolitan capital itself. For example, William Strachey's A True Repertory of the wreck in Bermuda of 1610, which gave an account of the shipwreck of the ship called the Sea Venture off the coast of Bermuda as it was heading for Virginia, was widely known and is taken to be one of the sources for the image of the shipwreck in the opening of the Tempest. The Florentine Antonio Pigafetta's The First Voyage Around the World, 1519 to 1522, was also widely popular when it was first published in 1534 and was available in translation in England. Like other travelers' tales of the period, it purported to provide a true account of the places that had been encountered in the New World. Gabriel Garcia Marquez isolates Pigafetta's travel narratives for special mention in the opening of his 1982 Nobel Prize acceptance speech titled The Solitude of Latin America. Marquez says, Antonio Pigafetta, a Florentine navigator who went with Magellan on the first voyage around the world, wrote upon his passage through our southern lands of America a strictly accurate account that nonetheless resembles a venture into fantasy. In it, he recorded that he had seen hogs with navels on their haunches, clawless birds whose hens laid eggs on the backs of their mates, and others still resembling tongueless pelicans with beaks like spoons. He wrote of having seen a misbegotten creature with the head and ears of a mule and a camel's body, the legs of a deer and the whinny of a horse. He described how the first native encountered in Patagonia was confronted with a mirror, whereupon that impassioned giant lost his senses at the terror of his own image. The deadpan inflection of the words strictly accurate in Marquez's account, coupled with his nonchalant listing of what are evidently fantastical elements from Pigafetta's journal, are stylistic devices that will by now be familiar to readers of his magical realist novels. Indeed, magical realism will be the subject of several episodes of Critic.Reading.Writing in the near future. Pigafetta wrote about the Patagonians of South America, claiming that they worshipped a great devil Setebos, which name is considered to be a precursor of the identity of Sycorax, Caliban's mother. Pigafetta also wrote of great tempests, assaulted giants, and many cannibals, and about St. Elmo's fire, which is a flaming phenomenon sometimes seen in stormy weather at prominent points on an airplane or ship. It looks to the eye like a blue discharge of electricity. Shakespeare had at least incidental indebtedness to Pigafetta's widely accessible source. There were also many extensive popular cultural sources in the period about the barbarism and strangeness of natives of the New World. It is clear that Shakespeare drew on an imaginative composite of the image of Caliban and of the island that the play is set in from the many ideas about natives of the New World that circulated widely during his time. Even though it did not take long for the island in which the Tempest takes place to be placed somewhere in the Caribbean, the imprecise location of the play's actual setting made it infinitely adaptable from the period of its first performance. Given that after the coup that overthrew Prospero from the throne of Milan, he was placed in a boat with his daughter Miranda and cast out in the Mediterranean, there is more than a hint that they must have ended up somewhere in North Africa. In his first dialogue with Ariel, Prospero states that Sycorax was an Algerian witch who conceived Caliban before she was banished to the island. This reference to Africa is, however, complicated with references to Bermuda in the play that echo William Strackey's shipwreck account we have already alluded to, thus placing it in the Caribbean. The violent storm that opens the dramatic action, along with the lush quality of the natural environment on the island as it is described, has been taken to suggest a New World setting, with Caliban figured variously as a Native American or simply an indigenous native of the New World. To complicate this imprecise location of the play that seems to combine both Africa and the Caribbean, critics have also noted that the Tempest seems to point to Ireland. While Caliban's description as somewhat stunted and malodorous reinforced the stereotype of monstrosity and civilizational deficit that was seen to apply to both Africans and natives of the New World, it is interesting to note that the Irish were described with the same intense pejorative terms during the period. In Barnaby Rich's A New Description of Ireland, published in 1610, the Irish were described as rude, unclean, and uncivil, cruel, bloody-minded, apt to commit any kind of mischief, and also prone to rebel against their English princes. Thus, the Irish were taken to epitomize English ideas of barbarism and rudeness, unruliness, and political disorder to an extreme degree. Ireland provided a real-world landscape for Elizabethans in the period to vent their imperial ambitions and also to suppress indigenous plots and rebellions, as Dimpna Callahan notes in her Irish Memories in the Tempest. Indeed, Ireland was for several centuries the testing ground for many colonial space-making policies that subsequently got exported to different parts of the empire, thus illustrating what we observed last week as a complex relationship between external and internal colonialism. This is a point well noted by Joseph Clary in his essay Postcolonialism in Ireland in the Cambridge History of Postcolonial Literature, and he is not the only one. The Tempest has a fruitful morphology of hierarchical relationships, including those between father and daughter, master and slave, king and subject, and tyranny and rebellion. It also contains the all-important dialectic of colonialism and the resistance against it, which makes the play one of the most favored parables of colonial spacemaking in postcolonial studies. The plot of The Tempest is highly elliptical, leaving ample room for speculation about what may have happened in the relationships before the play begins, both in terms of events in Milan and Naples and also on the island itself between Prospero, Caliban, and Miranda. What I want to focus on now are two interrelated questions, namely the different colonized subjectivities of Ariel and Caliban, and the ways in which nature in the play is firmly placed at the service of power and ideology, thus also ultimately making it an instrument of colonialism. This is what we see in the first dialogue between Ariel and Prospero early in the play. Prospero: Ariel, thy charge exactly is performed, but there is more work. What is the time or day? Ariel: past the mid-season. Prospero: at least 2 glasses. The time twixt 6 and now must by us both be spent most preciously. Ariel: is there more toil? Since thou dost give me pains, let me remember thee what thou hast promised, which is not yet performed me. Prospero: what now, moody? What is it thou canst demand? Ariel: my liberty. Prospero: before the time be out? No more. Ariel: I pray thee, remember I have done thee worthy service, told thee no lies, made no mistakings, served without grudge or grumblings. Thou did promise to bait me a full year. Prospero: dost thou forget from what a torment I did free thee? Ariel: no. Prospero: thou liest, malignant thing. Hast thou forgot the fowl which Sycorax, who with age and envy was grown into a hoop? Hast thou forgot her? Ariel: no, sir. Prospero: thou hast. Where was she born? Speak, tell me. Ariel: sir, in Algiers. Prospero: oh, was she so? I must once in a month recount what thou hast been, which thou forgettest. This damned witch Sycorax, for mischiefs manifold and sorceries terrible, to enter human hearing, from Algiers, thou knowest, was banished. For one thing she did, they would not take her life. Is this not true? Ariel: I, sir. Prospero: this blue-eyed hag was hither brought with child, and here was left by the sailors. Thou, my slave, as thou reportest thyself, was then her servant, and for thou was the spirit too delicate to act her earthy and abhorred commands, refusing her grand hest, she did confine thee by help of her more potent ministers, and in her most unmitigable rage into a cloven pine, within which rift, imprisoned, thou didst painfully remain 12 years, within which space she died, and left thee there, where thou didst vent thy groans as fast as mill wheels strike. Then was this island, save for the son that she did litter here, a freckled whelp, hag-born, not honored with a human shape. Ariel: yes, Caliban, her son. Prospero: thou best knowest what torment I did find thee in. Thy groans did make wolves howl and penetrate the breasts of ever angry bears. It was a torment to lay upon the damned, which Sycorax could not again undo. It was mine art, when I arrived and heard thee, that made gape the pine and let thee out. Ariel: I thank thee, master. Prospero: if thou memorest, I will rend an oak and peg thee in his knotty entrails till thou hast howled away 12 winters. Ariel, pardon, master. I will be correspondent to command and do my sprightling gently. Ariel's humble reminder to Prospero of his promise to give him his liberty very quickly descends into what we can only describe as extraordinary bullying on the part of Prospero. He does this first by rudely dismissing Ariel's self description as having been a loyal, conscientious, truthful, and perfect servant in undertaking all the tasks assigned him. Instead, Prosper reminds him of how Sycorax imprisoned Ariel inside a tree for 12 years, from which Prospero rescued him when he himself arrived on the island. More telling is Prospero's threat to lock Ariel up inside a cloven oak for another 12 winters if he doesn't shut up and do what he's told. By the end of the dialogue, Ariel has been reduced to meek obsequiousness. What Prospero has done here is to use both the reminder of past bondage and pain and the threat of further pain and imprisonment to secure Ariel's continuing servitude. Prospero does go on to repeat several times in the course of the play that he will give Ariel his liberty. But that does not cancel out the fact that Ariel is not allowed to forget the threat of pain and imprisonment that will come upon him if he disobeys his master. The conversation between Caliban, Prospero, and Miranda that follows shortly after this dialogue in Act 1, Scene 2 shares similar features to the one between Ariel and Caliban, except that in his case, Caliban absolutely refuses to acquiesce in his continuing servitude and reveals the spirit of unremitting rebelliousness by which we recognize him throughout the play until he's reduced to apology at the very end. It is in the first conversation between them that Caliban issues his famous words about the uses of language that he has been taught by Prospero. Caliban, you taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. The red plague rid you for learning me your language. Caliban's words here recall to mind Stephen Dedalus' oft-cited reflections on the English language in James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Quote, the language in which we are speaking is his before it is mine. How different are the words home, Christ, ale, master on his lips and on mine. I cannot speak or write these words without unrest of spirit. His language, so familiar and so foreign, will always be for me an acquired speech. I have not made or accepted its words. My voice holds them at bay. My soul frets in the shadow of his language. Unlike Caliban, who, as we have just seen, proudly celebrates his capacity for using the language of the colonizer to curse him more effectively, Stephen's views speak to the subtle ways in which the colonial language surreptitiously cleaves identity in terms primarily of a splitting or self-division, but also as the means by which the colonial language binds the colonized identity to the colonial self. Wherever languages were taught to local populations, Whether this was English, Portuguese, Spanish, French, or Dutch, they ended up producing ambivalent subjects. For even though the colonial language was supposed to be an instrument of comprehension and governance, it instilled in the colonized native the capacity to see the contradictions inherent to the colonizers' so-called civilizational project. For their civilizational project was also a project of utter barbarism, as writers as varied as Aimé Césaire, Edouard Glissant, C.L.R. James, Frantz Fanon, and various other postcolonial writers have shown. When Caliban proclaims his ability to curse, he is also stating the way in which the colonizer's language can produce unanticipated forms of subjectivity and rebellion. In his case, that of an uncompromising critique of colonial relations. For the major difference between Caliban and Ariel is that Caliban does not just desire his freedom, he also lays strong claim to ownership of the island itself, thus setting up the classic template between territorial colonialism and the resistance against it that has been much discussed in postcolonial studies. It is, however, when we come to look at Caliban's description of nature within the play that we get the full measure of the complexity of his colonized subjectification. Caliban is what we might describe as a man of nature. His language is filled with the most poignant descriptions of the natural world. At one point, he's plotting with Trinculo and Stefano on how to overthrow Prospero and seize the island. Trinculo is a jester and Stefano is a drunken butler, and both of them are part of the shipwrecked team from Milan and Naples that have been scattered on the different parts of the island. They have chanced upon Caliban and have formed a triumvirate of the marginalized against their different masters. Stefano is at this point singing a drunken tune, and this is what we see. Caliban. That's not the tune. Stage directions. Ariel plays the tune on a tabor and pipe. Stefano. What is this saying? Trinculo. This is the tune of our catch, played by the picture of nobody. Stefano. If thou beest a man, show thyself in thy likeness. If thou beest the devil, take as thou list. Trinculo. Oh, forgive me my sins. Stefano. He that dies pays all debts. I defy thee. Mercy upon us. Caliban. Art thou afeard? Stefano. No, monster, not I. Caliban. Be not afeard. The isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometimes voices that if I then had waked after long sleep will make me sleep again. And then in dreaming, the clouds, methought, would open and show riches ready to drop upon me, that when I waked, I cried to dream again. Throughout the play, Caliban speaks some of the most beautiful lines about nature, such as we see here, where he describes the symphony of gentle sounds that pervades the atmosphere of their island and puts him to sleep to have sweet dreams of pleasure and wealth. The problem, of course, is that in this particular instance, it is the invisible Ariel that is playing the tune on a tabor and pipe. This then puts us in serious doubt about what Caliban says about the natural music of the island, since there is strong suspicion that in previous instances it was Ariel sent by Prospero that had been playing pleasant natural music to lull Caliban into sleep. What we see here then is a worrying link between nature and artifice that is also evident in the storm scene that opens the play. The shipwrecked crew from Milan and Naples have their hairs stand on end at the frightful storm they have just experienced. But it comes as a shock to the audience when Ariel appears later to report to Prospero that he has diligently manufactured the illusion of the storm as prescribed, and that the members of the ship have been duly scattered on different parts of the island. This link between nature and artifice is extremely unsettling because it also suggests that all that is natural on the island has really been placed in the service of ideological obfuscation by Prospero. The link between nature and artifice also provides a hint on how the project of colonialism was inextricably entangled with that of producing nature in the New World in forms of the picturesque. This exposed the subject to both aesthetic judgment and colonial management at one and the same time, as is amply demonstrated in D. Graham Burnett's Master of All They Surveyed, Exploration, Geography, and a British Eldorado. The many explicit images and references to labor in the play, such as in Caliban's and Ferdinand's hewing and carrying of wood, must also be tied to the question of governance. For nature and artifice have become inseparable parts of the ideological manufacture of subjectification and thus of the exploitation of labor. The use of nature in The Tempest is arguably different from what we see of it in other Shakespearean comedies, such as A Midsummer Night's Dream or As You Like It, in which, as we saw in our episode on the Merchant of Venice, nature tended to function as the sphere for the purgation of false ideas of love, and thus also as the sphere of healing as opposed to aggravation. The use of nature in the romantic comedies may also be contrasted sharply to how we find it in a play such as King Lear, where the stormy scenes on the heath also serve to illustrate the relationship between the king's unhinged mind and its discordant refractions across the natural and celestial world. This correlation between mind and world or universe was pertinent to geocentric models of the world and ideas of the great chain of being, where it was matters on earth that dictated matters in the celestial sphere and not the other way around, as was later to be made dominant in heliocentric models that came to predominate thinking on these relationships steadily from Copernicus to Newton. Next, we are going to be examining in turn different examples of the relationships between nature, colonialism, and postcolonialism in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Jean Rhys's White Sargasso Sea, and Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things. Thank you very much. If you like this episode, please remember to give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.